Today, we're going to be looking at a really tough but absolutely crucial topic, the conflict in Gaza, but specifically through the lens of international law. We're going to break down the major allegations that have been put forward by investigators and human rights groups, all to help understand the legal principles right at the heart of this conflict.
You know, every single war is supposed to have rules. There's this whole framework called international humanitarian law, and it's designed specifically to limit the brutality of conflict. But what happens when those rules are allegedly broken, not just once or twice, but on a massive scale? Well, that's the big question we're tackling today.
All right, first up, let's talk about protecting people. We're going to dive into the allegations that surround the most fundamental things, life and safety.
So, probably the single most important rule in war is something called the principle of distinction. It means armies have to distinguish between fighters and civilians, period. A central allegation in Gaza is that this rule was just systematically violated. We're talking about documented attacks on apartment buildings, on refugee camps, on shelters. And it's led experts to argue that the sheer scale and pattern of these events suggests it's way more than just a series of isolated mistakes.
Beyond the direct attacks, there's another really grave allegation on the table. The idea that starvation itself was actually used as a weapon of war against the entire civilian population.
So how could something like that even happen? Well, you can see the alleged actions here. Sources have documented these severe restrictions on the basics, food, water, medicine, with aid convoys being blocked again and again. And the consequences? They're just devastating. Widespread hunger, malnutrition, and people dying from illnesses that should have been treatable. It got so bad that UN agencies came to a really stark conclusion, describing the situation as man-made famine conditions.
And let's be crystal clear about the law on this. International law could not be more direct. Deliberately starving a civilian population as a tactic, as a method of warfare, is a war crime. Full stop.
Next up, we have the allegation of forced displacement. Sources have documented these repeated mass evacuation orders, but the orders apparently came without providing any safe routes or shelter or even supplies for the people being told to move. There are even reports of people being attacked while they were trying to flee or after they arrived in these so-called safe zones. Now, temporary evacuations for safety can be legal, but investigators argue these conditions weren't met, which would make this an unlawful forcible transfer.
The allegations also get into the treatment of thousands of detained civilians. There are numerous reports detailing people being blindfolded, stripped, and held for really long periods of time without any charge. And this is where the Fourth Geneva Convention is so critical. It says that non-combatants in a conflict zone have a protected status. They have to be treated humanely and can't just be arbitrarily detained.
Okay, on to our second section, protecting places. Now we're going to shift from people to the alleged destruction of the very infrastructure and sanctuaries that support civilian life.
One of the most sweeping allegations is that the destruction of civilian infrastructure was so systematic and so widespread that it's effectively made huge parts of Gaza completely uninhabitable.
I mean, the sheer scope of the documented destruction is just staggering. We're not talking about a couple of damaged buildings here. We're talking about entire neighborhoods wiped out. Hospitals, schools, universities, places of worship, even the most essential services like water systems and bakeries. And the law is really firm on this. Destroying civilian objects on this kind of scale without a proven, direct military necessity for each one is a war crime.
Now, within that widespread destruction, there's one category that really stands out because of its special legal status, and that's the alleged attacks on hospitals and medical personnel.
See, under the Geneva Conventions, hospitals are given a very special protection from attack. It's not totally absolute, but the bar to legally attack a hospital is incredibly high. An army has to have concrete proof that the hospital is being used for hostile military acts, and they have to give an effective warning before any attack could even be considered lawful.
All right, our third section is all about the rules of warfare itself, because it's not just about what is targeted, it's also about how the attacks are carried out.
Okay, so let's break down the legal difference between a lawful and an unlawful attack. A lawful attack is supposed to be precise. It targets clear military objectives, and it does everything possible to minimize harm to civilians. An unlawful attack, on the other hand, is what's alleged to have happened in Gaza. These are attacks that are either indiscriminate, meaning they don't distinguish between military and civilian, or they're disproportionate, where the civilian harm is just wildly excessive compared to any direct military gain. The widespread use of massive bombs in densely packed urban areas is a huge focus for investigators here.
And that brings us to another core allegation,
that the civilian population of Gaza was subjected to collective punishment, which is basically punishing an entire population for the actions of a specific armed group.
So what does that actually look like in practice? While sources point to things like cutting utilities for everyone, the mass destruction of homes, blocking aid for the entire population, and restricting everyone's movement. These are all cited as potential evidence of collective punishment, which, you guessed it, international law explicitly forbids as a war crime. You just can't punish a whole people for the actions of a few.
And finally, there's the allegation of obstructing accountability itself. Think about it. With independent investigators and journalists heavily restricted from even getting into Gaza, and with a shockingly high number of journalists being killed, trying to document potential war crimes becomes almost impossible. And investigators warned that this lack of transparency can itself be a tool to hide systematic violation.
Okay, so what does the global legal community actually make of all this? Let's take a look at the international legal view.
There's a pretty strong consensus forming among UN experts and major human rights organizations that the evidence points toward war crimes. Some are even saying that certain actions could meet the legal definition of crimes against humanity. And this is the really crucial part. These aren't just reports being filed away in a cabinet somewhere. These allegations are now under active investigation at the highest courts in the world, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court.
There's a powerful quote from the source material that I think really sums up the whole legal argument. It says, "These outcomes are not accidental side effects. They reflect patterns of conduct that international law exists to prevent." And that just gets to the very heart of these allegations. The idea that what happened wasn't just a series of tragic accidents, but a systematic pattern of behavior.
All of this really leaves us staring down a pretty fundamental question, doesn't it? What is the purpose of international law if its most basic rules can be broken on such a massive scale? There's no easy answer to that, but just confronting the question is absolutely essential. Thanks for joining us.